Hello, everyone. Let me take these off for a second. So first, let me say thank you to Stephanie and Jean for this beautiful invitation, and specifically for this beautiful exhibit. It is a real delight to be in the midst of Sánchez's work as we explore it. I'm thrilled to be here and humbled to be in dialogue with my co-presenters, Alison Cluck and Cecilia Fajardo-Hill. And finally, thanks to all of you for being here today. Thanks to the workers who made this room so beautiful and tidy for us. So my talk will go over about 4 different parts, and I'll just go ahead and get started. Part 1, Encuentrismo, a chance encounter. I learned of Zilia Sánchez's work first through chancing upon the undulating curves of it. During the summer of 2018, I was developing a graduate class in collaboration with Princeton Art Museum's holdings, and I went to the museum's storage facility to look at some of the works in the collection not on display. I found how a museum's excess, that which does not enjoy exhibition, retires in long metal scaffolding. And I was en route to look at one of David Wojnarowicz's pieces in the collection and took a happened glance down a storage aisle to see a canvas stretching outward, extending past the dimensionality of other pieces. I stopped. I had to look twice, at least, because I had never seen anything quite like it before. The piece was Amazona, and these 2, or is it 4, breast formations reached and beckoned me through a translation of geometric abstraction with bodily and mythological illusion offered and withheld. The topological force of this piece comes from its form that arrests movement, reminds us of canvas's ability to stretch. The piece features shapes recognizable as breasts and yet unlike any breasts I have encountered. Amazona surfaces as 2 peaks separated by a cleft in the canvas and punctuated by 4 cresting nipples. These are mountain breasts with rings of topographic areolate shading. The points or nipples are rendered flat, blunt tips that arrest our erotic analogies and recompose the piece in its own taut corporeality. Eros here is highly abstracted and yet still tactile, still bodily. If it is by chance that I first encountered Sánchez's work in 2018, then it is also chance that will provide incredible inspiration for Sánchez herself. And yet it's no mere chance that it was 2018. There's another way of telling the story of that same year that would mark a shift in attention to her work, as Stephanie had alluded to. It would be only with a few shows in New York in 2013 and 2014, and notably the 2018 exhibition, Radical Women, Latin American Art, 1960 to 1985, that Sánchez's work would start to gain traction and momentum in the US. Sánchez's erotic signification morphed considerably over her career, and she came to be known for her erotic topologies that we're surrounded by today. Undulating paintings created by stretching canvases over hand-molded wooden armatures and painting them with spare acrylic colors, usually pastels, neutrals, grayscale, black. Her taut surfaces and visual abstractions withhold as much as they suggest, and none can be said to clearly represent her in relation to her own ethnicity, gender, or desire. That is not to say that her biography or her life is insignificant to her work. Instead, what this suggests, and what I think is so provocative, is that her work is not immediately legible as Latinx, queer, feminist, Caribbean, Cuban, or Puerto Rican as such. Her work registers force, conjures an erotic semiotics, yet disallows any stable referent or message to emerge from the work. It haptically seduces, invites direct gaze and sideways glances, and also withholds content sometimes promised in the titles that allude to mythological features, such as Amazona, Antigone, etc. And much of Sánchez's work will be similarly seductive and withholding. Her artistic journey folds the personal into the abstract in such a way that the only perceptible contours of indexical detail become productively difficult to discern. So concentrating on the evolution of her topologies, my short talk today will consider how Sanchez's formal experimentation and life trajectory add nuance to conventional notions of how one's biography and aesthetic practice form a complex entanglement. And here I really want to emphasize that one of the things that becomes difficult about underrepresented artists is that when they enter into the room and they get some notoriety, there's a burden of representation often placed on those artists. And I think for me, Sanchez became a very important way to think outside of that. So as we will see, Sanchez's works operate at a complicated level of signification, utilizing contingency and force to communicate something other than a discernible concept or a message, something easily signified. Part 2, a dot, a nib. What attracts our attention is the migration of one sign or symbol to another, however minute, a dot, for example. And little by little, the widening displacement of graphemes, this extraordinary repertory of objects extending, for example, from a cave painting to calligraphy, or to a rug, a tattoo, a basket, or an embroidered scarf. Yet this tremor of signs is nothing other than the productive motif, itself itinerant, of our interrogation. The displacement of signs in a wandering series whose graphic representation sometimes vibrates in an efflorescence of meaning, and sometimes freezes this migration in place, effectively erasing the gyratory space that is thereby reduced to a dot, a nib. And that's by Khatibi, Tattoos, Writing in Dots. And I think we can see this very well displayed to our right. In 1968, Zilia Sánchez pressed an ink pen to paper to create the most basic kind of mark, a dot. By arranging many dots into 3 larger, undulating forms, el significado del significante appears at once abstract and discernibly corporeal. The minimal dot is the only mark that composes the larger forms of this drawing. The dot here cannot be said to be the period at the end of a sentence because this dot gathers density and grows in saturated thickness. Then it thins, radiating, creating edged borders and radial projections. Inscribed into an off-white background, these dots gather and disperse, or perhaps better put, they emanate. They disseminate and seemingly self-organize into clefts, folds, and mounds that are connected and contoured only by the dots. These shapes beget other forms, other movements. It is radically unclear which is the first mark, though concentration and density can be discerned. Some dots cluster to form folds, evoking buttocks. In the bottom right corner of the drawing, we see another form. Is it an egg, an ovum pollinating, or a breast fertilizing? We see in almost pointillist form the space of migration, the pollination of a buttock, the fertilization not of but from an egg. The more one looks at the piece, the more one is confused about where the punctum may lie and what forces make these forms. One zooms in to see the mark, the textured minimalist point, and then takes a step back to see the larger, loose, abstracted but perceptible composition in this drawing. What connects these dots? And where do the forces of concentration and brittle delineation lie? How is organic form rendered from the most basic mark of ink? And how does the title of the drawing, El significado del significante, or the signified of the signifier, inflect how we may begin to make sense of this abstractly evocative drawing? Again, I return to the perplexing title, which evokes a baffling scene of reading. The title demands and obstructs reading, insists on multiple interpretations across discourses, times, and networks. It pushes at an opaque representation rendered in sumptuously abstracted corporeal form. Why the signified of the signifier? Of the piece, Sánchez settles not on one but 3 things that quote-unquote this might be. She says, this is an egg, it's the world, and it's a breast. 3 things. So the signified of the signifier is not one but 3 things, 2 indefinite and 1 definite, the only definitive thing being the world itself. Semantically, Sanchez's answer demands more readings and more questions. Is this referring to the painting as a whole, one of the shapes? Is it naming the three largest discernible shapes? These questions and tensions urge a reading or many readings, and this productive motif, this itinerant motif, was why I was so thrilled to use this piece on the cover of my book, which asks how, not what figures of Latinidad represent, but how we read figures of Latinidad. So I wonder then how the artist herself would make of the title over time, because this is not the only interpretation she's given of this piece. But before I answer this, I must make a detour into Sanchez's network and their modes, her friends and their modes of thinking. This professional moment was a particularly fertile one for Sánchez, involving much reading about the philosophies of sexuality and eroticism, while also working a lot of jobs in furniture restoration and set design in New York City. Her New York City was a diasporic hotbed of production and conversation that gravitated around recent Cuban immigrants in New York City, meeting with Puerto Rican and other Latin American intellectuals and artists. Her encounter with linguistic theories would come from her dear friend, Severo Sarduy, who summoned her to New York, another queer Cuban artist who could read the bellwether of constricting life in Cuba and urge Sánchez to join him abroad. Sarduy's notable place in letters marked him as a neo-Baroque and Cuban writer who, like Sánchez, explored corporeal fecundity and sensuality, a writer who would remain most Cuban abroad. And here we see Sarduy is all the way over there in the corner. So too was Sarduy, a vital interlocutor with the group behind the literary journal Tel Quel, a group of writers, philosophers, and thinkers in France who rehearsed semiotics and considered the linguistic turn beyond the specificity of natural language as such. This group consisted of thinkers like Julia Kristeva, Roland Barthes, Jacques Derrida, Jacques Lacan, and Françoise Wahl, Severo Sarduy's lover. This piece hails from a series of drawings, El Significado del Significante, and they have different formations that are really fascinating. The signified of the signifier. The title evokes another layer of signification that is at once a suggestion and an abstraction. How do these shapes represent, index, or refer to a conceptual framework that deals itself with marks, graphs, and graphemes? And here we see some of that work. How does this drawing evoke a theory so thoroughly linguistic, rendered in graphic form? The terms signifier and signified belong to a very particular vein of French theory, critical theory, that takes its insights from Ferdinand de Saussure's Insights on Linguistics and Semiotics. In his course on general linguistics, Saussure offers the notion of the linguistic sign, and we see that here. The sign is the totality of both the signifier and the signified, and said that it comprised of a signifier, which is known as a sound image, and the signified, which is known as a concept or idea that the signifier corresponds to. But one thing Saussure puts into this particular linguistic theory is that correspondence is arbitrary, and that signifiers as well as signifieds get their meaning not through a positivism, but through a negative differential by all the things it is not. Saussure's insights would usher in what is known as the linguistic turn in theory, and these theoretical conversations around signs, signifiers, and signifieds were catalyzed in Europe by Tel Quel. And that was a particular literary magazine that ran from 1960 to 1982. This reframing of signification has been one way to think through the operations of difference at the level of language and at the level of peoples. But the strangeness of signification, of language, often pushes beyond any easy representative force. Sanchez's drawing takes this a step further by translating this dense vocabulary of semiotics into graphic form. How can a drawing, itself a graphic, refer to another system entirely? Or is it another system? How does a title, surely inspired by Tel Quel, migrate onto this suite of drawings? The signified of the signifier seems an unlikely appearance visually, since we tend to think that we read signifiers alone. That is, we often think of the signifier as the discernible mark and the signified as the meaning. Here in this rendering, the signified is actually the most abstracted graphic mark that one can make, a dot. The canvas looks more like an atmosphere than a base, and the relative opacity that the dots produce give form to shapes at once organic and abstracted. These shapes seem to be in process in a kind of autopoiesis. Dots concentrate to create force and the impression of cleft flesh. A spore-like dispersal radiates, creating a wave, a lined apex, a descent sloping toward unfinished buttocks. To make a mark of the signifier aligns the signified, the concept itself, with the movement of the signifier, thus allowing us to see why Jacques Derrida states early in Of Grammatology that there the signified always already functions as a signifier. The secondarity that it seemed possible to reserve for writing affects all signifieds in general, affect always already the moment they enter the game. There is no signified that escapes, eventually to fall back, the play of signifying references that constitute language." End quote. In this formulation, the signified functions as a mark. It is in the place of a signifier. It is in the place of play, which means that the supplementarity of writing subtends what we may imagine to be a concept, meaning, or referent. To inflect the signified as a mark, as Sanchez's work does, is to consider the purchase that conceptual work operates referentially, but also itinerantly, a way of perceiving something like the material world. So in light of such connections, one would and should expect a direct relationship between Sanchez's title and this particular literary movement. But Sanchez replied rather coyly to a suggestion in a 1928 interview with Zilia Sánchez, the main curator of Sanchez's retrospective, Soy Isla. She asked about the 1968 drawings and their evocative title that, quote, directly echoed French structuralism and the semiotics of the late 60s. Were you aware of those theories? Or perhaps familiar with Tel Quel, a journal of literary criticism established in Paris in 1960 by a group of philosophers, writers, and poets? To this equally erudite and Eurocentric question, Sanchez responded with an answer quite apart from her previous interpretation of the piece, breast, egg, world. I don't think so. But given that Severo was in those circles, he could have introduced me to their ideas, because we would talk a lot. He was a little younger than me, but we had known each other from childhood. He was extremely supportive of me and wrote beautifully about my work. He was an exceptional person. He was also the one who said to me early on, "Stay abroad," end quote. Notice how Sanchez doesn't refer to Sarduy by his last name and places him into the intimate story of her life by using his first name. She then expands out to the circles and conversations they shared over a lifetime and their chain of associations. What her circumlocution lands upon is Severo as support instead of Sarduy as phallic font. So too does she guide us back to herself, or rather to her work. Sanchez's answer reveals a material set of connections that made her friend Severo exceptional. This exceptionality is underscored by his advice to stay away from Cuba's increasingly restrictive and notably homophobic regime. Implicit in this simple statement is a world of queerness, diaspora, relative privilege, and erratic movement, a life of thinking across graphemes, signs, continents, and oceans. Sanchez expressed no further interest in Tel Quel, but rather in friendship as a reading practice, a reading of one's work, a reading of another's discourse, a reading of political climates. While others have carefully compared Sanchez's work to Severo Sarduy's, and there are undeniable thematic resonances here, Sanchez herself opens up the possibility of influence in the conditional tense, could have, and then shifts to the material and intellectual life their friendship encapsulated. And I'm interested in how Sánchez narrates her friendship with Sarduy as a material set of concerns rather than a theoretical source. While Sánchez demurs over Sarduy's influence over her semiotic titles, she does credit him with influencing her work by way of reading its erotic aspects. When asked what books she had been reading about eroticism in New York, she answers, quote, "I read so many books on sexuality, eroticism, and communication. And then one day, Severo came to visit and whispered, 'Those are tetas, boobs.' You did breasts, Zilia. That's why I started using eros in my titles," end quote. One can almost read the wry smile as Sánchez relates this story to Stratinovich, only compounded by a follow-up question asking if the artist herself had thought of these as tetas. Sánchez exclaims in a quick retort that she had thought of them as mountains. With this set of interpretations, our readerly task may be rearranged, may be charged to even read referential works or works that allude to verifiable historical or mythological figures with less assurance about the status of referentiality, to chart trajectory but not telos, connection but not causality, matrixial entanglement but not linear relation. As a taut surface, Sánchez's works are exposed and withholding, much like these canvases. Sánchez transposed the linguistic turn onto the canvas itself, a canvas she would at the same time learn to stretch and contour. As felicitous visual interlocutors for the linguistic turn, Sánchez's works push the page and the canvas into abstraction, an intention that finds its topography in the erotic feminine. Part 3, the Puerto Rican zone. After time between Madrid and New York, Sánchez moved to San Juan in the 70s, where she said, quote, "Going to the blue sky and the ocean of Puerto Rico was almost like going home. Besides, the language is the same and the people are similar. We're built from the same mold. Cuba and Puerto Rico are two small islands that cannot fight big powers. I say this because I am not a rebel. I am a realist," end quote. If Puerto Rico was almost like going home, then it becomes clear that home was not an option to return to. The 1970s will not only shift place for Sánchez and her next 5 decades of work on the island. Her signature style will also cohere around this era, the sculpted canvases and erotic topologies. She also enters into a slightly different milieu in San Juan. Indeed, a commissioned cement mural for the Laguna Gardens condominiums allowed Sánchez the opportunity to settle in San Juan. There, too, she continued her contact with the literary scene of San Juan by way of Rosario Ferré, who commissioned Sánchez to design the journal Zona de Carga Descarga. The journal would have a short but impressive run, and it would include minor writers from Latin America, writing in Portuguese, Puerto Ricans, New Yorkers, but also women and a whole cadre of homosexual writers. And they all return to this question of signification. They're learning to write in a zone, both literal and imaginary, in Puerto Rico, in a post-Cold War Puerto Rico, in the middle of Latin American booms, explosions that are literary and otherwise. And this is one of the designs for Zona that Sánchez had done. And I should note that she had also worked on a lot of other print publications prior to this. In Zona, and here we see Sarduy. I just love that she reads him back and does another kind of transmogrifying work with him here. In Zona, Argentine art critic Marta Traba would write one of the first reviews of Sánchez's erotic topologies entitled Eroticism and Communication. But we see very quickly that something other than knowledge or content is sexually communicated in these pieces that refuse both simulacra and confession, while also thoroughly complicating our notion of surface, creating tension. This tension becomes one that finds purity in Traba's readings as the novelty of these equilibrized pieces came into the art scene of Puerto Rico. In them, she reads a harmony or a tension that Sánchez herself often tried to achieve in the pieces. She writes, life and human relationship, gesture and coupling, alternate in this powerful text, where a perfect accord or agreement has been achieved between signifiers and signifieds, end quote. The taut tension here is read as a chord in agreement, though I would pause to ask what precisely these pieces communicate. The message is not discrete, and it seems that the conceptual and the image create not so much an agreement, but strange and itinerant movements between signifiers and signifieds. Part 4, and this is the final section, dejar de ir. Contingency endings, recursive loss. Sanchez's first major exhibition, titled Soy Isla, traveled from DC to Ponce to El Museo del Barrio in New York. The exhibit featured an artist's documentary told in vignettes, fragmented and poetic. There, Sánchez details one source of her topologies, a moment of chance, of loss, and of the elements at play in a section of the film entitled La Sabana que Flotaba, or The Sheet That Floated. This details a moment of grief over the imminent loss of her father in Cuba. Sánchez narrates the time of her father's death, how as he was dying in his deathbed, she went up to the azotea, or the rooftop, to do some chores and saw a white sheet hitting a tube and immediately began to cry. As Sánchez narrates, quote, "This sheet, es curioso, this sheet made me use it in order to make art." This story is told with clear conviction, with the vividness of an embodied feeling of impending loss, met by both tears and a demand by the sheet floating against a tube, a chance. That story is linked as both death and genesis. It is connection, she says, quote, "It's very connected to my art because my father, I wasn't going to have him anymore," end quote. The connection is not given content, a discernible signified, and it is not the kind of connection built on presence. The connection itself is loss, but it is loss of the death of a father, and it is one that foretells loss to come, as any parental death does, and more so when one feels that they may also lose not only a father, but a patria and a country, as Sánchez did. In that loss, unexpected aesthetic lines, movements, and peoples make up the matrixial milieu of Sánchez's culture. Rebellious against rigidity, Sánchez maintains the role of the misfit student after the death of her father, after the loss of her nation. And Cuba's repressive politics under the Batista regime had already led her and many of her fellow artists and writers to use abstraction to stage nuanced anti-governmental works under that particular taut cover. Islands have a way of measuring loss as recursive. Returning to Puerto Rico meant returning to a more familiar island, and there Sánchez would make one of her most singular pieces through exposure to the elements, encuentrismo, ofrenda o retorno. The encounter or offering or return, 2000 in San Juan. This piece is a video of a performance from a series titled Soy Isla, Compréndelo y Retírate. I am an island, understand and retreat, where the viewer watches Sánchez repeatedly throwing one of her topologies into the ocean, staring at it as it rides the waves, dips under foam, rolls onto the shore, and back again, Fort Da. Years before many of her paintings would meet the downside of contingency and suffer from Hurricane Maria's impact on San Juan, at that moment, a lot of Sánchez's work actually were exposed to the elements in an awful way through humidity, but there was a lot of restorative work that happened there as well. So before this moment, Sánchez enacts this exposure as encounter and submits Soy Isla, this topology, to the ocean in a manner wholly reminiscent of Ana Mendieta's shoreline silhouetas, but a repetition of a motif with marked differences. Soy Isla carries with it the topographical trace of many of the other topologies, including Amazonas, and many other of Sánchez's most pointed topographies. Mountain begets breast, which begets an island being made not by Sánchez herself, but with the transmogrifying help of the ocean. Of the piece Encuentrismo, Sánchez says that she, quote, wanted her to go. I wanted to see her in agony, end quote. Encuentrismo undulates physically and in form. In this register, loss becomes both source and loss as practice. And indeed, in the letting go, Sánchez abandons some of the taut equilibrium for another kind of encounter of her topologies, which don't break, but do weather. What returns of Soy Isla? What do we make of the title that tells us to leave, but beckons us to survey the damage of leaving, the wear of waves, the return to the shore? Exposed to the sea, the tension between the title and the works create the tensile equilibrium that her work more generally conjures. This recursivity of Sánchez's early work returns with Encuentrismo with a forceful update in both Sánchez's formal innovations and the structural weather shifts that have encased life and loss over the years. The surface tension, lag, and ruin become palpable, but their oblique meaning stays at a remove, at a retreat like an island that was a volcano and may not stay above water over time. Soy Isla, a title within Encuentrismo, and also a title for her first retrospective, a retrospective of life and art made at various crossroads of political and aesthetic movements. At first glance, such a title may seem inherently individualistic and, moreover, sovereignly so. But upon rereading Robinson Crusoe, Derrida will say, quote, "There are no worlds, only islands," end quote. And then we may consider this claiming of being an island as something peculiar. This tension is read most deftly by the late Mara Negrón, a feminist deconstructionist theorist who worked in Puerto Rico. Negrón reads this particular kind of provocation of islands between Jacques Derrida and Jamaica Kincaid's A Small Place to get at the particularity of what one wants from and in an island. The desire to be an island, the desire to leave an island, the desire to return to an island. She writes, quote, "Hence, it is not that we are before two different options, whether to run away from the island or run away to the island. But instead, every running away, every withdrawal into oneself presupposes the desire to be an island," end quote. Negrón continues, quote, "Therefore, the island is in itself a sort of running away, an impossible dwelling," end quote. This impossible dwelling in isolation or in sovereignty is redoubled by the material history of Caribbean island nations, which struggle with sovereignty, whether due to colonial status, departmental status, or the difficulty of self-sustaining small economies in the larger global structure of financial capitalism. If islands are impossible dwellings and impossible sovereignties, then Soy Isla becomes worn by the conditions that themselves wear down islands. Because islands are always not the world as such, and therefore always incomplete while gesturing toward bounded solitude, we may read anew Sánchez's claim to be an island, to be left alone, and this leaving requires the desire to return, the desire to leave, the desire to touch her canvases, see them from afar, from the side, up close, and after the weathering, and after the ruin. And so too does Sánchez play with the surface tensions in her work, gesturing toward a oneness while always playing with twos that distillate and disseminate into threes and more, bringing us back to the basic foundations and the basic formations that an artist might make: the dot, the cleft, the mountain, the island. Thank you.